Something slams into the side of the bus. Hard. The vehicle rocks. The driver kills the engine, and in the sudden silence, the teenagers inside hear something moving in the dark outside, something that isn't walking on two legs. It's October 1962, and a group of young people on a field trip through the rural backroads of Prince George's County, Maryland, are about to have an encounter that nobody will fully explain for the next 60 years. Not the police, not the county, not the government facility sitting less than 4 miles away. Prince George's County in the early 1960s sits in that strange liminal space between suburban America and deep rural wilderness. Bowie, Maryland, the town at the center of this story, is a place of modest homes, church socials, and farmland that still hasn't been swallowed by Washington, D.C.'s sprawl. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, and kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. Nobody here is looking for monsters. Nobody here expects to find one. The group that night includes a mix of teenagers and a handful of adults serving as chaperones. By most accounts, there are between a dozen and 20 people on that bus when it rolls down the isolated stretch of Fletchertown Road, a narrow two-lane that cuts through dense Maryland woodland so thick in places that headlights can barely reach the tree line. The road is not a shortcut. It isn't a scenic route. It's the kind of road you only take if you know exactly where you're going. And that night, someone or something is already there waiting. The bus stops for reasons that vary depending on who you ask. Some say the driver noticed something in the road. Others say the engine stuttered. What everyone agrees on is what happens next. There is a sound, described variously as a scream, a bellow, and a sound like metal being torn, and then an impact against the side of the vehicle. Not a glancing blow, a deliberate, heavy strike. Then another. The windows rattle, someone starts crying, and through the glass, in the faint wash of the headlights, several witnesses report seeing a figure. Tall, wrong proportions, moving with a gait that human legs don't produce. Here's what they didn't know. Less than 4 miles from Fletchertown Road sits the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, a sprawling 6,700-acre federal facility operated by the United States Department of Agriculture. On the surface, it's a farming research station, but the bark, as locals call it, has been quietly experimenting with animal genetics since the 1930s. By the early 1960s, it had become one of the most advanced agricultural science facilities in the world, conducting research on hybridization, hormone treatment in livestock, and experimental breeding programs that were classified, not for national security reasons, but for commercial ones. The agricultural industry was, even then, a multi-billion-dollar apparatus, and the patents and processes developed at Beltsville were worth fortunes to the private contractors and corporations funding the research. What escaped from that facility, if anything did, has never been confirmed, but the local legend crystallizes around a figure that witnesses describe consistently, roughly 7 feet tall, walking upright, with the upper body of a heavily built man, and legs that bend at an angle suggesting something closer to a goat or large ungulate, hence the name that the Maryland press would eventually coin, the Goatman. But here's the thing nobody tells you in the tourist versions of this story. The bark wasn't just doing benign crop research. Federal records declassified in the 1980s confirmed that by 1962, the facility was conducting hormone and endocrine experiments on large mammals, cattle, sheep, and primates, with funding partially sourced from private agribusiness interests worth, in today's dollars, hundreds of millions annually. The economic engine behind American agriculture had a vested interest in keeping those experiments quiet, not because they were building monsters, but because the techniques being developed, accelerated growth hormones, structural modification through selective breeding and chemical intervention, were the early foundation of what would become the modern factory farming industry, practices generating over $700 billion globally today. Fear was a useful tool. A monster story that kept civilians off Fletchertown Road at night was a far better security solution than fences and guards that would attract attention. Whether the Goatman was real or manufactured, the effect was identical. Nobody asked questions, nobody went looking, and the research continued undisturbed. The teenagers on that bus, though, don't know any of this. All they know is that something hit their vehicle hard enough to leave marks that the county sheriff's department photographs the following morning and never officially explains. One chaperone, a 34-year-old teacher named Helen Howes, according to contemporary local newspaper accounts, describes the creature in enough detail that a sketch artist produces a rendering. That sketch runs in the Prince George's County News in August 1962. The paper receives more letters in response to that article than to any story it had run in the previous decade, because people recognized the description, because other people had seen it too, and none of them had said anything, because who would believe them? This isn't just history. The same playbook, use local fear and folklore to suppress investigation of corporate and government activity, is still running. The sacrifice zones in rural West Virginia, where residents report strange environmental phenomena near chemical plants. The communities in Louisiana's Cancer Alley told for decades that the sicknesses clustering around petrochemical facilities were coincidences, not causes. The pattern is identical. Isolate the community, let the legend grow, and let human beings' own tendency toward supernatural explanation do the work that expensive cover-ups can't. The real monster of Fletchertown Road was never the Goatman. It was the assumption that powerful institutions would ever voluntarily expose what they were doing in the dark, whether that's a government agricultural facility in 1962 or an industrial food system in 2024 that still operates significant portions of its research outside public scrutiny. We want the Goatman to be real, because a creature is easier to understand than a system. A monster you can run from, a system you're already inside. The bark still operates today. It covers the same 6,700 acres. Fletchertown Road still cuts through those same Maryland woods, and the full scope of what was researched there between 1950 and 1975 has never been fully declassified. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What other local legends are quietly doing the work of keeping you away from powerful people don't want you investigating? And what's happening in the dark while you're busy being afraid of the monster? Drop your theory in the comments, and if you want to keep pulling on threads like this one, you know what to do.